Nau mai hoki mai, iho mā, pai kia kite koutou ki kua nei. Welcome again, friends. It's great to have you here for this gospel reflection today. Kei te whakarongo mai koutou, ki o ki whakaaro, ki te rongapai a ihu karaiti tō tātou āriki mō tēnei rā. And our gospel today comes from Matthew chapter 5, beginning at verse 1. I'd love to be able to continue to speak to you in Te Reo Māori, the beautiful and chiefly language of this land, but unfortunately most of you wouldn't understand what I was saying. So I'll continue in that trading language of English, which allows us to communicate across borders and build friendship and relationship. And in these strange times with COVID running rampant around the world as well, it's affecting us here in New Zealand. We've been in lockdown for the last 2 weeks as the Delta variant has burst through our borders. It's given me plenty of time to do some preparation in the garden for spring, a little bit of home maintenance, and also to spend quite a bit of time exercising with my family, and also preparing this talk. And as always, the timeless life of Christ has something to say to us today in whatever situation we are living in. So let's begin with these words from Matthew that you're probably familiar with. They're called the Beatitudes. They come from the beginning of the Sermon on the Mount. When Jesus saw the crowds, he went up the hillside and sat down. His disciples came to him. He took a deep breath and began his teaching. Wonderful news for the poor in spirit. The kingdom of heaven is yours. Wonderful news for the mourners. You're going to be comforted. Wonderful news for the meek. You're going to inherit the earth. Wonderful news for the people who hunger and thirst for God's justice. You're going to be satisfied. Wonderful news for the merciful. You'll receive mercy yourselves. Wonderful news for the pure in heart. You will see God. Wonderful news for the peacemakers. You'll be called God's children. Wonderful news for people who are persecuted because of God's way. The kingdom of heaven belongs to you. Wonderful news for you when people slander you and persecute you and say all kinds of wicked things about you falsely because of me. Celebrate and rejoice. There's a great reward for you in heaven. That's how they persecuted the prophets who went before you. This is the gospel of Christ. Wonderful news, great news, good news, not good advice, but good news. This is what the gospel is, good news. These words that are attributed to Jesus we hear today read like headlines, like chapter headings in a book, and really they are. On their own, they don't actually say that much, but if we dig down below each line, we will discover rich resources for a full and free life. We'll discover good news for battlers and misfits. The first headline, Blessed are the poor in spirit, takes me immediately to King David, after he is caught out covering up his lust and adultery with Bathsheba by arranging the murder of her husband Uriah. It's pretty terrible stuff. And we hear him pouring out his brokenness and his groaning and an aching prayer in Psalm 51. A broken and a contrite heart, O God, you will not despise. Or maybe you've begun the 12 steps of an AA program or something similar and come to acknowledge that you are powerless over your addiction. This embracing of our weakness, our vulnerability, our poverty of spirit, our not having the answers or not knowing what is always going on, can be the entry point to God's kingdom. The last headline about persecution takes me to the parable of the talents, where the last man was given only 1 talent by that austere king who was going off on a big overseas trip. The other 2 traded their money and made more, and they were, talked up by the king when he came back. But the last man had buried his talent in the ground in protest, and he was beaten, thrown out, persecuted, for showing that king that his money was impotent and evil. It couldn't produce anything. It couldn't produce a crop like seeds do when they're planted in the earth. So it can be easy for us to feel persecuted over all sorts of things, maybe even having to get a vaccine or wear a mask. Or maybe we feel persecuted because we do wear a mask willingly. This last headline is about being persecuted for walking in God's ways of justice, mercy, and love. And to unpack all of these headlines would take a long time. So we need to engage with the whole story of the life of Christ, the previous Old Testament story and history, all the parables, all the interactions on the road, in the temple, and with Christ crucified, abandoned and alone as an outcast criminal on that cross. To be able to mourn, to be meek, to be humble, to have a pure heart, to be a peacemaker, to seek for God's justice and righteousness must be more than headlines or bumper stickers in our lives. Each of these headlines cries out for us to fill in the story below. What are we filling our life story with? Are the actions of our lives giving our biography or even our eulogy an honest and righteous depth? Last week, Sean spoke about painted, whitewashed tombs and how their religious elite were getting a tune-up from Jesus. As bikers, we know that chrome don't get you home. All the bling, all the whitewash will never make our motorcycles reliable and fun to ride. We need to dig below the surface. Just the other week, my bike wouldn't start and was giving me grief. A simple problem in the end with the battery lead fraying at the end and not letting power get through. It looked fine from a distance, and I checked heaps of other wires first, but I went back to first principles to the battery and went down and took that wire off, and sure enough, a problem was exposed. It was easy to fix, and my bike's going fine again now. It just shows that maintenance on our bikes is a discipline that pays off big time on the road. Digging deep below these headlines will pay dividends in our lives too. And the good news is that we do not need the bling and the outward appearances to cover our battle scars. The righteous life of living in the way of Jesus will give us the strength we need to get home. Rejoice, says Jesus, when you're struggling, when you're mourning. Be humble, seek the truth and what is right. Seek to have a pure heart and look for peace. This is the way to God's kingdom, to fullness of life. In our ongoing time of upheaval, of polarization and despair, and again, it was no different in the time of Christ in Palestine, as the people there tried to deal with an occupying empire that was ruining their lives and making them choose all sorts of crazy things. These timeless truths from Christ can build bridges, bring hope, healing, and even resurrection to our lives. So as disciples of Jesus, as followers of Jesus, may we keep choosing to walk in his way. And may our lives become wonderful stories that give depth and richness to these amazing stories. Kia kaha iho mā, ki roto te aroha o te atua. Be strong friends in that love of God. Rangamārie kia